At the outset, I would like to thank IDMA to invite me for their Diamond Jubilee conference and to speak on Pharma R&D moving from pockets of excellence to an ocean of excellence. The question that I'm raising is whether Indian pharma R&D can create an ocean of excellence in the next few years. In order to do that, I will be first of all looking at the India's position on the global innovation map. We'll benchmark ourselves with other innovation hubs like India. We'll also look at the factors that are disrupting the innovation cycle uh, post-COVID. We will try to understand what kind of an R&D ecosystem will be required for this new uh, disruptive pharma R&D. And finally, the most important question that we'll try to address is where do we find the money for these molecules that we would like to develop. The World Intellectual Property Organization released their Global Innovation Index in 2021. They ranked their 193 member states on 7 parameters to arrive at their score, and India outperformed in 5 out of 6 scores as compared to the countries in the same category, which is upper and middle income countries. And in this graph, which plots GDP per capita of these countries versus the Global Innovation Index, India prominently stands out. India has consistently improved its ranking in the last 4 years, not just on the Global Innovation Index, but also in the innovation inputs as well as innovation outputs. However, if you look at the India's position on the global map of R&D in terms of the number of global R&D centers of multinational corporations, India has very few as compared to US and Europe, where the basic R&D seems to be concentrated for pharma. But even comparing India to China, we have only one third of the global R&D facilities in India. So it becomes necessary for us to look at India's ranking with respect to other countries and benchmark India's capabilities on the innovation map. And the first parameter is the total number of patents. And if you compare 2011 versus 2020, the gaps in the number of patents between India and a few other countries in Asia is widening rapidly, and this is one important parameter India needs to improve. With respect to the number of researchers per million, again India has very few as compared to even a small country like Singapore, and this is another area where it is seen that less than 0.5% of students in India pursue their PhD, and this is another important factor that needs to improve. In terms of the funding of biotech, if you compare to global funding, which was more than 40 billion in 2020, Indian biotech funding was only less than 50 million. And this is despite of the fact that close to 100 biosimilars have been approved in India as compared to over 60 in Europe and about 26 in US, but these are old numbers of 2019. By now, over 100 biosimilars are already approved in India. However, during the COVID crisis, things have started changing, and there seems to be a gradual shift from a big pharma research to collaborative and virtual type of an R&D where big pharma is licensing products from small players. This is a major change that has happened as compared to the last many years. And if you see that the total R&D spending on bringing out one new chemical entity to market has started falling after a consistent rise in the last 10 years. Similarly, the overall peak sales of a new chemical entity uh, after marketing has started also increasing. And what is interesting to note is that the majority of the late stage pipeline or the assets have been licensed from outside. And if you compare the picture as you see in this graph as compared to 2017, where almost 70% were internal molecules, in 2021 almost 70% have been licensed in from outside. So this clearly shows the shift towards the small company R&D. Therefore, this is the right time to ask ourselves, can India scale up our innovative business driven R&D model to create an ocean of excellence? And therefore, if you have to remodel the current centralized capital intensive R&D model, we'll need to look at the factors that are disrupting the innovation cycle globally. The first important factor to keep in mind is that the overall medical therapeutics is moving from a generalized type of medicine to personalized type of a precision medicine. So creating blockbusters for a major disease is a thing of the past, where companies introduce one single blockbuster and they became huge in their size. These are things of the past. Today, the medicines are more and more targeted for a smaller and smaller segments of conditions, and we are almost moving towards a personalized medicine where certain tests are being conducted to identify the particular type of condition for which the drug is being introduced. So there is a shift in market dynamics from mass markets to niche markets, and that is something to be kept in mind. As a result, there are too many pressures internally within the R&D companies, even if they are big pharmas, because the current R&D is too much centralized, infrastructure dependent and capital intensive, that reduces the returns on the investment due to the spiraling R&D cost. The overall timelines for bringing out a molecule to market have lengthened considerably. The success rates are very unpredictable, that reduces the attractiveness, and most of the big pharmas in India have too much of dependence on branded generic products, and they are getting good money by exporting generics to the advanced markets, which continue to pay rich dividends. And therefore the R&D on the reverse engineering is a different mindset that conflicts with a completely innovation mindset, and therefore this becomes a very complicated situation for the R&Ds within big pharma, and thus the thirst for new molecular entities or new biological entities has reduced, because the big pharmas do not depend for their survival on these products. And the overall expectation from the Indian pharma R&D to repeat the success of generics or biosimilars in inventing new chemical entities or NBEs has really not materialized on a large scale, except a few pockets where the excellence has existed. On this background, are there any strategic levers that we can think of which can help us to revolutionize this R&D? The first and foremost is the innovation mindset and a passion for R&D which is required. The R&D setup has to be decentralized, with outsourcing to be considered to smaller players, particularly the startups. This will help in sharing the resources also with them. Uh, the use of advanced technologies are very much possible with the advanced IT and device industry in India. And finally, we need to look for newer funding models to be able to create a new R&D ecosystem, because one size fits all approach and a model is no longer sustainable, and we have to move towards a virtual R&D model to adapt to the new market dynamics. So let's look at what kind of an R&D ecosystem we need, for which we already have the big pharma playing an important role for R&D. There are thousands of startups which are coming up in India, but despite of that, they don't have too much collaboration with the big pharma. The regulator has done a excellent job in expediting the approval of COVID medicines in the last 2 years. They have really coped up with the huge explosion of new clinical trials and approvals that have taken place. The academic institutions have also coped up with the pandemic. However, they have to be reoriented towards applied research to be able to help the startups to create new ideas. And the same thing applies to the hospital and CROs, which are currently only conducting clinical trials, but they have to step out of their silos and assist in creating new ideas for new products for the startups and pharmas. And lastly, the piece that is missing here so far is the private equity firms, which currently are spending only 3% in pharma R&D, but we need to identify the new players who will be interested in investing money on pharma R&D. Is it possible for us to look at the COVID experience of the last 2 years and transfer the best practices to the post-COVID times? I think one area that prominently shoots up is the repurposing of old drugs for new uses. And the best examples we have seen are remdesivir, tocilizumab, and baricitinib, which were not meant for COVID, but they were repurposed for the use of COVID in a very, very short time by conducting only clinical trials. So if we apply this model for other diseases and conditions in the post-COVID times, it is possible that small startups can, and the pharma can, in consultation with hospital doctors, come out with new ideas. And if it is either a new fixed dose combination or a new formulation or a new idea, then all that needs to be done is a toxicology in a toxicology CRO, pharmacokinetic interactions to be ruled out, and the phase 3 studies to be conducted in a randomized control double-blind model, and that can provide approval. And the relevant ecosystem already exists for such a model for repurposing of drugs for another indication. We have the hospital, we have the startups who can patent the idea in collaboration with the hospital. We have the toxicology CROs, we have the BAB CROs for conducting kinetic studies, and the clinical trial CROs which can do the phase 3. But to make this machine go around, private equity funding is very much going to be required. Funding seems to be the main issue for R&D in India. If you look at the national level, India spends across all industries only 0.7% of GDP on R&D, as compared to the other BRICS countries like China, which is about 2%, Brazil over 1%, and Russia around the same. Most of the funding in the R&D space is by the government today, and the private financing is only to the tune of 3%, and is out of 192 billion which is going into pharma R&D. And the entire startup environment is very much scattered because the small pharma startups are not well connected with the big pharma. And for funding their own new chemical entities, big pharma also finds it difficult to support the entire pipeline independently from their own revenues, simply because they generally don't exceed 7 to 8% of their revenues on R&D, and therefore they are also looking at external funding for funding their own. Ernst and Young, in fact, did a survey of about 50 startups, and they found that funding support was the key challenge as came out from the survey. And they looked at the funding that exists today in pharma startups, and most of it was from the government. BIRAC is from the Department of Biotech. Startup India is funding few startups. DIPP and other schemes exist, and also Nidhi Prayas. So some of these schemes are actually funding most of the startups. The government funding seems to be well organized, starting with ideation to early stage, whereas grants such as BIG, standing for Biotech Ignition Grant, supported almost 600 projects, leading to about 150 startups, and 200 IPs were filed. These build ideas up to the proof of concept stage, and then from proof of concept to the late stage, there are other grants which are available for the SMEs to boost the public-private partnerships, and more than 200 projects have been supported. Creation of 32 IPs and 56 products and technologies have occurred under BIPP and PACE. And there are schemes for equity financing as well, which are coming out of the BIRAC's Bionex schemes, and there are incubators such as Seed and Leap, which enable selected and the most innovative startups up to the pilot stage, or they also help commercialization of products and technology. So, what are the challenges for private financing of pharma R&D in India? What ails PE and VCs? I think mainly long gestation periods, high risk, and uncertainty of pharma R&D leads to limited financing by private players, and we need innovative funding models. Where there is a lot of risk sharing mechanisms available. For example, in some of the countries like Hong Kong, Israel, and Europe, there is a co-investing model where government and private players in venture funds invest in a ratio of 1:2. So therefore the risk is shared. At the same time, the due diligence is very impartial. There are convertible grants available in some countries, where grants are converted to loan if the project is successful. If not, it is written off. And in the US, they did a good experiment of crowdfunding the R&D in the form of either donation, loan, or equity. And in a span of a decade or so, almost $150 billion were generated in the US through this mechanism, in a huge country like India, with a lot of HNI individuals, as well as a very strong population of upper middle income group. It is worth experimenting with such models also. So what are some of the things that can be done in India to incentivize the pharma R&D? I think first of all, the tax deductions have to be restored back to 200%, which existed before. The government can restore the tax holidays on the R&D spend. There is a nice patent box regime which has started, but however, it is important to increase its attractiveness by expanding the current scope to include not just the licensing fees and sales on patented drugs in India, but also from abroad. Also to include the income from the patent settlements, that is also very important. There has to be clinical exclusivity for those companies which are introducing products through clinical trials, and such products should also be provided a price freedom at least for a few years. Currently, it is only on the patented products. And finally, pediatric exclusivity is something still missing in India that can be provided. So if some of these schemes are started or restarted, a supercharged R&D can start using then advanced technologies, which are very much possible, that can revolutionize India's place on the global innovation. These advanced technologies can become enablers to fast track projects and make them far more cost effective. And it is possible today with the advanced uh, IT industry in India, as well as the device industry. So we have cloud and edge computing possible. This is a age of wearables and sensors, and there are several Indian companies which are now introducing such products There are genomic tests which are developed, the rapid antigen tests that were developed for COVID in a record time from Indian companies, Indian startups was amazing. Nobody thought that the such tests could be distributed in the homes and conducted there at a very cheap rate. We have the artificial intelligence as well as augmented and virtual reality already operating in the some parts of the pharma industry which can be expanded. And finally, blockchain technology can revolutionize supply chain for pharma in a manner that could not have been imagined before. Does it sound difficult? I don't think, if we decide we can really venture into these advanced technologies. I want to quote a Roman philosopher Seneca who said that it is not because things are difficult that we do not dare, it is because we do not dare that things are difficult. And fortunately, we have a leader of the nation in the form of Mr. Narendra Modi, who said that our diversity, our demographic potential, fast growing market size, and digital infrastructure have the potential to make India a global hub of research and development. I thank you for your attention.